Right. This session is on risk and mitigation, and Ron has given us a perfectly splendid start to that. As with yesterday, we're going to have 2 more talks before the break, then a further talk after the break, and then a panel. And responding to your feedback from yesterday, the panelists are not going to give presentations. We will move straight into the discussion to give more time for you to offer your comments and questions, brief comments and questions from the floor. But there's good news and bad news about the first presentation. The bad news is that it was to be given by a gentleman from Cuba who would have been able to share with us what some of us in this room know to be a fascinating story about Cuba's actual experience with peak oil, because of course they've been through a form of peak oil artificially imposed on them by the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they got the majority of their oil supplies, and the US sanctions of that country. He hasn't been able to come, unfortunately, though some of the speakers this afternoon will be talking about themes that some of us know from that experience in Cuba, which is by no means all bad news, and there's quite a bit of encouraging stuff there. I've been asked by the organizers to stand in for our Cuban speaker, and I'll be doing that in just a second, and I hope to build on some of the themes, both in terms of risks and mitigation, that Ron has offered us. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Chief Executive of Solar Century, a solar energy company based in London. But like a number of the speakers yesterday and Ron himself, I'm a geologist by origin and actually a member of that Oxford mafia, as Ron refers to it. I had the same PhD supervisor at Oxford as Colin Campbell did, and indeed Ron himself was one of my mentors when he was at the department at the same time as I did my PhD. So those are my origins, and I have interests in both peak oil and climate change as a consequence of this. And I'm going to talk about the nature of the conflated risks in these 2 problems. 4 things to cover. I want to say a few words about awareness of climate change and peak oil, and then I'm going to talk about the arithmetic of carbon and fossil fuels and build on some of the things that Ron has introduced. Third point, rather briefly, some thoughts on explaining the risk involved with peak oil, because this is a big challenge that all of us face. And then finally, conflating the 2 briefly at the end, looking at the dangers and the opportunities. That old cliche that I don't even know if it's true, but you hear it all the time. The Chinese character for change involves sub-characters for danger and opportunity, and the relative weighting of those as we look at the conflation of these 2 problems. So, magazine covers from America in 2006. In 2005, this wasn't deemed to be much of a problem. In 2006, you could barely pick up a magazine without seeing reference to it, very often on the front cover. Things are changing out there at the moment. And here, perhaps one of the most extreme examples, when you have global warming on the front cover of Vanity Fair, you know that things may be about to change in society. A threat graver than terrorism is the conclusion, with icons of our times, Julia Roberts and George Clooney, clad all in green. And of course, if you look very carefully down at the bottom, you still have the normal stuff, sex and the city for teens, but in small font. So one of the big questions is, how is business reacting to this kind of issue branding? These are very big events if they get onto this kind of front cover. And here's the latest. This is from The Economist, actually the current issue. Don't look at the brand, just think who might be putting this in. War on global warming needs more warriors. Is this a worldwide Fund for Nature advert? and a little kid looking up at his father. What did you do in the war on global warming, Daddy? Is the subtext there. No, this is not Greenpeace or WWF. This is Sargas, a fossil fuel company. This is the world we're living in at the moment. And even in the business magazines, you can see how this is resonating, both the solutions and the billions of euros that are flowing into them, and also the wider way in which business is taking the issue seriously. And we're living in a world where the retailers are at war with each other, vying for customers on a front including how deep they can go with greenhouse gas emissions when they could get away merely with shallow cuts like governments. And Walmart, that favourite bête noire of environmentalists, is now scarcely credibly rewarding its store managers on how much carbon they save at the end of the month, as much as how much profit they're saving. So business is actually out ahead of government and indeed of individuals and communities, I think, on this issue. There's real, genuine business leadership out there, and I speak as someone who used to be an environmental advocate. I can recognize greenwash when I see it. Now, why is this? And the reason, I think, is because it's happening. The first events are rolling out across the world, and very depressing they are too. And if I had to pick 3 of them to try and persuade any residual doubters in this room, it would be the state of the Greenland ice cap, the emissions from the Siberian tundra, and the atmospheric carbon dioxide record. In Greenland, we now have meltwaters which were nowhere near as extensive a few years ago, flowing right down to the base of that 3-kilometre ice sheet in fissures called moulins, and here you see one of the waterfalls as they go down, lubricating the base. And the glaciologists who study this are noting speeding up of the ice sheet egress points, and of course, if that ice sheet goes into the ocean in some way, mechanically or via melting, then global sea level goes up 7 meters, fully 7 meters. Last year, a team of Russian and American scientists measured methane egress across the melting Siberian tundra, and they made the calculations of what they thought they would find with the observed warming, and they found 4 times the methane egress that they expected. And finally, perhaps most worrying of all, the long-run build-up of carbon dioxide, which we heard about yesterday, having been steady right through to the 1990s, then proceeded to speed up, and over the last few years, 4 or 5 of the last years have been particularly bad in terms of the input, the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And of course, the fear here is that the first amplifying feedbacks are kicking in, stratifying oceans, melting permafrost, drying soils, all that kind of thing, effects of drought. So when you look at that awareness factor out there in society of global warming, and you compare it with, as it were, our awareness factor of the forthcoming energy crisis, as I'm sure most, if not every, member of the a person in this room believes, we're really pitifully short of that. It's not that we haven't been on front pages. It's been on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. This is a recent issue of The Independent, an interesting story. A journalist called up, having been given the brief of covering the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, which was released, called me on the street and said, "We gather you may have some thoughts on this." I said, "Yes, I do have a few thoughts, but really you need to be speaking to Dr. Campbell in Ireland and Mr. Skrabowski at the Energy Review." And having done that, this journalist obviously experienced his peak oil moment. We hear stories of people talking about their peak oil moment, and he persuaded his editor, and we woke up the next morning and there we were on the front cover of The Independent. But this is an isolated example, and we need to figure out how to bring more journalists and more people generally to their peak oil moment. Why would they not arrive at one, of course? And nobody here needs reminding of the IA view in the recently published review of world energy. We have to get to 116 million barrels a day, according to their latest calculation, down from 120. Non-OPEC oil is going to peak, as we heard so compellingly yesterday, anytime soon. And most of the lion's share will have to come from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Nobody needs to dwell on that to see what a tall order that's going to be. Other points? Investment. $4 trillion of investment to make it happen. And we, the IEA, are not certain that it will happen, simply because of the difficulties facing individual investment decisions. The apparent surge is illusory because of inflation, and Claude Mandel's most outspoken remark yet: this energy scenario is not only unsustainable, but doomed to failure. Now, why aren't alarm bells ringing in every industrialized government as a result of that report, which essentially they commissioned? But they're not. As we look at the politicians, we've heard some cynical thoughts yesterday that I think have a lot of truth in them. But what about the officials? What are they thinking about? They're supposed to be safeguarding our interests and the interests of the economy going forward. And I'm sure many people here have experience. ASPO members have trodden the corridors of Whitehall trying to awaken the Department of Trade and Industry. I myself have personal experience here. I was on a government advisory panel for 4 years, and towards the end of that time, I raised the peak oil issue and suggested that we simply had a rapid deployment policy group that studied some of the things that we've heard about from Ron Oxborough and worked out how quickly we could do it in extremis. The next communication I had from the Department of Trade and Industry was a letter firing me from the board. Now, I don't know, that's unfair probably. I don't know that those two things were created. God knows they were fed up with the sound of my voice by then. I was fed up with the sound of my own voice on other issues. But you see the point. Certainly there's been no traction that anyone here in ASPO that I know of has had. The corporate denial. Exxon took out an ad in the New York Times, I'm sure many people saw it, saying there's no peak in sight. Now, if we go on the climate change experience, the day that Exxon takes out ads is the day that you know you have a problem. If you look at their 17-year history of behavior at the climate negotiations, this truly is treasonous behavior, I would argue. I mean, they have at best obfuscated, on some occasions, we would suspect, and I have consulted a libel lawyer about what I'm going to say now, lied about climate change. And now, of course, they've been forced to cease and desist by their own shareholders because of the reputational problems that they've accrued. Individuals and corporations, I know many people in the oil industry. One of my former classmates is now head of exploration in a company that had better be nameless, still cloaked in denial about this, even though his own company only manages just a few percent of world oil. And the treason argument, I don't know how many of you have been exposed to this, but when I debated with Ian Vann, formerly head of exploration at BP, at Cambridge University, he produced an argument that I first saw from CERA, which goes as follows: peak oil is rubbish, but there's a real danger here. And that is the people who espouse peak oil might make it happen simply by turning it into some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is, they don't quite use the word treason, but that is a deeply irresponsible path to take. And so we really have a long way to go in this debate. And then, of course, individuals, we all have experience of the don't spoil the party syndrome at dinner parties among our own friends and indeed family members. So this is a steep cliff that we have to climb. Climate change conflates with this problem, and we now know that as you go back through the ice record, we can measure the carbon dioxide for more than 600,000 years. It goes very closely with temperature, and as geologists, it's not surprising to us that the temperature goes first, just by a little bit, and then the carbon dioxide is primarily a feedback response as we go into and out of ice ages. That wouldn't be a surprise to us. This is a different forcing. This is the fossil fuel forcing that's taken us up to 380 parts per million and counting, and that has had the following effect. Latterly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have begun to attribute this and many other manifestations of that spike of carbon dioxide to the first faint footprint of human enhancement of the greenhouse effect. In other words, we are seeing the signal come out of the noise. And this is where the IPCC think we're going in one of their scenarios towards the bottom end of that envelope of scenarios that Shell Aleklet showed yesterday. There are a large number of scenarios. We, I think, probably most, if not all of us, would have reason to believe that there are real problems with fueling those scenarios with enough fossil fuels, but, this is a really important point, if the sensitivity is such that we only need a little carbon dioxide to do the real damage, that's what we should focus in on, and that's what I'm going to get to in a minute, and that would be a point of quite profound difference that I would have with our distinguished chairman. Because, really, many people now believe that the threshold of danger, extreme danger, is quite low. The European Union has been negotiating based on a 2 degrees Celsius increase on the pre-industrial now since 1996, and you see what that looks like relative to a proxy record from the Northern Hemisphere here. And if you take some of the common model runs from the IPCC, anything like business as usual without really deep cuts in emissions over the next decades takes us through that danger threshold in the earlier part of this century, not the later part. And the Stern Review, instigated by the UK Treasury, involving their head economist and working with the meteorologists and climatologists from the Met Office and elsewhere. So a collaborative piece of work by economists and climatologists have summarized all this really well. And you wouldn't want to go much above 2 degrees Celsius just on projected impacts on food crops, certainly not 3. As you look at water, really significant increases in problems. You just look at the drought now in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, 40% of Australia's domestic food supply under threat right now in Australia. And so 2 degrees Celsius, a real problem. Ecosystems, coral reefs are so temperature sensitive that we've already sadly done them irredeemable damage. But at 3 degrees, above 2 degrees, we're carving our way into other ecosystems as well. Not a good idea, as Ron Oxborough said. Growing body of thought, particularly worrying for insurers, that above 2 degrees Celsius you face unconscionable risk of increasing the intensity, not necessarily the number, but the intensity of the extreme events that have proved so ruinous over the last few years. And then most worrying of all, really, is the risk of abrupt and major irreversible changes being locked in. And the Greenland ice cap is just one of those examples, but the people studying it worry that above 2 degrees Celsius, you really face the prospect of locking in an unstoppable melting of that 3-kilometre thick monster. And so you have to ask yourself, what are the fossil fuel implications of this kind of danger threshold? And how much carbon, as it were, can we afford to burn unsequestered? Here we need to look at a little bit of complexity. Forgive me if you know all this, but many people coming new to the problem think just about carbon dioxide. We actually have to think in terms of a basket of greenhouse gases, 6 main families of greenhouse gases, of which carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning primarily is the worst. But these gases can be translated in terms of radiative activity into the equivalent of carbon dioxide. And here you see that in the mid-range of the estimates, the magical figure of 450 parts per million that a couple of our speakers referred to yesterday is the target that really we ought to be going for if we believed at all in a precautionary approach to this. We are at 430 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent today, 380 plus carbon dioxide, and then the rest. And that means we're locked into, at minimum, 1 degree Celsius. So you can see how close we are to real danger if we're not in it already. And so 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide itself, not the equivalent, is roughly the figure that you would want to go for to be sure of that 2 degrees Celsius threshold. And your budget, if you take the lower range of what the IPCC is projecting for the lock-in figure of what the burn would have to be to lock you into that temperature rise, is 340. And why wouldn't you take the lower end of that range on a precautionary basis, especially when you're being warned by the scientists that so many of the feedbacks that we know about qualitatively but can't quantify too well are actually amplifiers, positive feedbacks. So let's assume that that's the right figure, and then we look at the IPCC itself. Now, we've already had some discussion about these figures. We had it just now at the end of Ron's talk. Most people here who've studied this would not believe these figures, but this is what the IPCC has in its fourth assessment report in terms of broken down into unconventional oil and gas, and conventional and unconventional coal, with quite a bit excluded. No peat in here, no methane hydrates in here, but of course, as it were, EIA-type figures. There is an alternative view. I think many people in this room would subscribe to that view, and I'll give it to you in a minute. But let's just make the obvious point. You spread that 340 across the free fossil fuels, and you know you have a problem. Of course, we burn a bit more oil than we do gas and coal, but let's just take a simple-minded approach, and you see the problem there. Now let's look at the alternative view. If we early peakers are right, there's roughly 1 trillion barrels of oil left in reserves and deposits to be discovered, resources to be discovered, as we heard yesterday, which would give us 118 gigatons of carbon. If we adopt the same sort of approach, that's under half what the established view is. They're thinking in terms of 2, maybe 2.5 trillion barrels. Same assumption for gas. And for those people who have looked at those coal reserve figures, they're very patchy, but the Energy Watch group in Germany, Werner Zittel, and the gentleman in Caltech, whose name escapes me further, but Rutledge, Dr. Rutledge at Caltech, these are the kind of figures that they would probably zero in on total coal resource. And you see, we still have a problem, but that problem is much more focused. It's a coal problem. The depletion envelope is really probably going to define policy on oil and gas, and it's coal we have to worry about, unsequestered coal that we have to worry about. This then becomes very clear. So a few thoughts on peak oil, and this is just, I think, we need to spend time as a group thinking about how we best put these arguments over. Some of us have found that the best way to start is with America in 1956. You invite people to imagine that they're in America in 1956. You tell them the story, the Hubbard story, and you make the point about secondary recovery having been thrown at that down curve. And then you invite them to think about the global pattern and what will happen as a result of this kind of depletion happening on the planet. And might it not be the case that we're in America in 1956 as we look at this growth of fossil fuel use now, and then you tell them the ASPO story, the regular oil coming across onto its plateau and all this stuff that so many of us are so familiar with, and that then comes as a shock to people who are new to the problem. And this, I think, can help folk get to that peak oil moment quite simply if you use that sort of rather simple-minded extension of the American experience to the global. Then you go into the evidence of discovery and the expectation of future production to 200 billion barrels that we think, and evidently, so we heard yesterday, many people in the industry think is all that's left to find, and then it becomes easy for them to understand what that peak or plateau is likely to do in terms of the jaws of the crocodile, to steal from Shell Aliklet's remarks at the end of yesterday. So finally, conflation of peak oil and climate change problems. I'd like to offer a personal view, for what it's worth, of the top 3 dangers and the top 3 opportunities, and then compare the two to get some sort of sense of the equation and the weighting on either side of the equation. I think the top 2 dangers are the economic chaos that we would appear to be locked into, and denial thereof. You're going to find opinions outside this group that absolutely echo many of the sentiments we've heard from members of ASPO. After all, why not? Who actually said this? Why? The US Department of Energy, their Office of Naval Petroleum and Oil Shale Reserves. Worldwide economic chaos. That's why they want more funding to bury nuclear reactors in the oil shale, or whatever it is that they think they're going to do. We're not good at recognizing distant threats as a society, even if their probability is absolute. Society ignoring this is like the people of Pompeii ignoring the rumblings below Vesuvius. This memorable encapsulation of what we're dealing with in society was offered by our first speaker, not here, but a couple of years ago in Italy, in Rimini. And again, it's difficult to see why we're facing such a problem when you see the history of the oil price. Every one of these 5 spikes has been followed by recession. We're now in the 6th price spike. Everyone's amazed at the elasticity. We heard a great discussion of that yesterday afternoon. But there's, of course, for most people, an elephant in the room which they're not aware of that is just around the corner and that is going to compound that 6th price spike and test the elasticity to its stretch limits. The precedents involved escape causes. The first oil crisis, global oil supply went down 4%, real fears of depression. Fortunately, only grinding recession followed. The second oil price spike, escape clauses there in terms of Saudis being able to lift the pumping, the North Slope and the North Sea coming on, and bigger stockpiles available at the time. Fears of depression, but fortunately only a withering recession. And we have a sort of mini example to think of in the so-called fuel crisis. This is an advert that my company took out in 2001, where a few disaffected hauliers with mobile phones took it upon themselves to blockade in a half-hearted way a few oil refineries in the UK, as a result of which, to remind you, 30% of the nation's filling stations shut down. On day 1, there were mile-long queues. On day 3, the managers of the supermarkets were warning that we could run out of food in the supermarkets. On day 5, the government was thinking of bringing in the army. On day 6, people were stealing petrol out of the parked cars of working nurses. Civil unity hung by a thread, but of course there was an escape clause, and that was the Daily Mail told the truckers to stop blockading the oil refineries. But you see the point. We're really dealing with a very fragile system that is going to be profoundly shocked by what we feel we know is around the corner. Climate discounters, and here's where the denial thing comes in on the climate front, will turn to coal and tar sands, meaning, in a sense, that the outcome of the combined problems may be decided by the resource, and here I use that word in inverted commas. These, in a sense, aren't really resources any longer, decisions of 6 nations. We heard from Ron a little bit of this. The top 5 coal producers hold fully 3/4 of global reserves, even if they are inflating them. And many of these nations are the nations that are most in denial about global warming, particularly the States and Australia. We have to add Canada to that because of the tar sands, of course. I think my third danger is carbon capture and storage. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm in favour of carbon capture and storage. Who couldn't be, having heard the full survey that we heard earlier? But my fear, looking at my experience of policy, is that this will be used as a universal panacea. People will hold it up as something that can be done. We can keep going with fossil fuels, and then 2 things will happen. First of all, they won't put enough money into carbon capture and storage. That's already happening in the UK and in Europe. And number 2, when they do put money in, it will be at the expense of the renewables efficiency and alternative fuels. That's my fear. We have to guard against that very carefully, especially when you look at the power of the vested interest here. That's a good day in the Appalachians. That's a not-so-good day. That's a good day in the Appalachians. That's not such a good day. They don't call it mountaintop removal for nothing. And you can see the spread of this, even since the 1990s in blue there, since the Earth Summit. This is the kind of thing that the coal industry has been up to. And you see it on Google Earth, the mountaintop removal just in that area of one basin in the United States. So finally then, the 3 opportunities. Renewable energy and energy efficiency markets will grow explosively, whatever else happens. $70 billion went into private equity alone in the area of clean tech, energy clean tech last year, and that's growing expansively. That fantastic things are coming out of Silicon Valley as a result. I want to give you a feel for one member of the family, just one, not a magic bullet, but what the front lines of this revolution feel like for someone in a solar company. These are all Solar Century installations. This is an office block in the UK, and now we're looking at homes, a government building, solar electric roof tiles, the roof of the Eden Centre in Cornwall, a wonderful facade on a university, a school here, an industrial shed covered with solar, a community centre, another school, office blocks, flats, and finally, the first solar-powered street in the UK. And this is Yorkshire, this is the north of England, perfectly functional technology under cloudy skies. And the dark tiles are electric, solar electric, the paler tiles are solar hot water. And so you see, we can have solar combined heat and combined heat and power in the roof, and if we marry that with energy efficiency, we can put up zero-emission homes within a matter of weeks. You see how frustrating it is for someone who's a practitioner in this industry to be told that we need lots of new coal, lots of new nuclear. If we really believed in these technologies, we could take an enormous bite out of oil consumption, gas consumption, and emissions, because, of course, more than half the emissions come from buildings in the UK. Opportunity 2, just to flag this afternoon, is proactive organisation at the community level to soften the landing. We would have heard, had we had the gentleman from Cuba, that encouragingly 80% of the food eaten in Havana today is actually grown within the city limits. There's a story or two within that. And I would commend Rob Hopkins' talk this afternoon and follow up on the website of the Transition Town movement. Fantastic opportunities for proactive organisation. And we mustn't forget poverty alleviation in this. Kerosene lanterns in the developing world can be replaced cheaply with solar lanterns, and engineers from Solar Century and our charity Solar Aid train people in Tanzania to actually make these lanterns and lift themselves out of poverty, providing a lot of social goods as they do so. So we are in search, in conclusion, of a survival reflex. If you haven't read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, I commend that to you too. Essentially, in dealing with the conflated problems of climate change and peak oil, and we must conflate them. We're looking for a takeoff point in societal thinking, replacing energy and the way we organize our societies that will be akin to the takeoff of an epidemic. And the encouraging thing when you read this book is that this kind of thing has happened before in society. I don't have time to go into the details, but the final words of that book: look at the world around you, it seems like an immovable, implacable place. It's not. With the slightest push in the right place, it can be tipped. So opportunity 3, therefore, is a renaissance. As we come out of the inevitable downturn, we have to rebuild in a different way. The encouraging thing is that we absolutely can rebuild in a different way, and we're capable of organising great social breakthroughs. Another thing that comes to mind, of course, is the abolition of slavery. And this is the challenge that will face us, our children and grandchildren. Finally, 2 books covering these issues, The Carbon War and Half Gone. And if you have questions for me after the conference, these are my contact points. And thank you very much for listening to me.